Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm glad you're here. I'm Ryan Streeter. I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here at AEI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today for the release of this report, Work Skills Community, Restoring Opportunity for the Working Class, which is a product of a working group that's been meeting for over the last year and a half. The working group's been brought together by Opportunity America, Brookings, and AEI. And I was delighted to be a part of the group. It was a group of incredibly accomplished thought leaders, public intellectuals, scholars who put aside essentially partisan differences and disagreements in these very fractious times to bring their diverse ideological perspectives and public philosophies together to produce this report. I'm going to introduce our first two speakers today, and they will be followed by a panel, and I'll let the panelists be introduced by my colleague Robert Dorr, who will be the moderator when that time comes. But when we start, excuse me, we'll have a presentation by two speakers to lay out some of the findings from the report, and then the panel will dig more deeply into some of the issues. And before I introduce our speakers, just a quick word about the report and then about the working group. The report focuses on a working class America. Over the last couple of years, this population has really emerged both in terms of politics and in terms of our discussions of public policy as an important force in American life that's been neglected. For the purpose of the report, we define working class America as people that have a high school degree but something less than a four-year college degree and who fall between the 20th and 50th income percentiles. So for a household of two adults and one child, that would be between about $30,000 and $69,000 a year. This population has been hard hit by advances in technology, by our globalizing economy, and also through the dissolution of core institutions of civil society, such as the household, marriage, and civic institutions. This group really came together to look at policy solutions that can be formulated, we hope, in a bipartisan way to address the needs and challenges that are facing this population. And I think it's an optimistic report. I think we achieved more than some of us, I'll speak for myself, thought we'd do when we started. And that goes to the second point, which is the group itself. It's a group of incredibly professional people, as I mentioned, but also just a group of colleagues. It was a great experience and an honor to be a part of this group of people who came together in an incredibly collegial way to think very constructively about policy solutions that people on the right and the left can agree on. And last thing I would say about the group is everyone just cares. I was really impressed by the quality of scholarship, but also just by the fact that people in this group really care about this population and want to see us do something constructive and productive. And so with that, let me turn this over to our first two speakers. I'm Tamar Jacoby, as the president of Opportunity America and the real driving force behind the group and the report. And Tamar's the author of a couple of books. She's a former journalist, editor at Newsweek and New York Times. Editorial page. She's formerly the president of Immigration Works USA and an expert on immigration policy. And then also we have, following her, Bill Galston, the Ezra K. Zilka Chair at the Brookings Institution and a senior fellow there. Bill's the author of 8 books, over 100 articles, former advisor to President Bill Clinton and multiple presidential candidates, and known to many of you here. And so I look forward to their remarks to kick us off, and then they'll be followed by the panel. And so I think first we'll start with Tamar, and then we'll hand it over to Bill, and I'd ask you to please join me in welcoming them to AEI.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Ryan. Good morning. Let me get situated. It's a pleasure to be here. I know it's early in the morning, but I'm going to dive right into policy proposals. There is a good backstory to the report. Why the working class? Why bipartisan? What happened behind the scenes in that room where we, members of the group, duked it out and to come to some bipartisan solutions. And that is a good story, but I'm not going to tell it. What I want to do this morning, our aim this morning for the morning is to air a few proposals and get some feedback on them. Do they really hold water? Will they work? And so I'm going to spend just a minute or two talking about fundamentals, if I can figure out how to make this work. Ryan talked about our definition of working class, so I'm not going to bother you with that, but I'll flash it up there. And then a handful of core facts, and then I'm going to zero in on some proposals. So the definition, Ryan talked about it. The main thing here is we did have two dimensions, education and income, and it amounts to nearly 40 million Americans, Black, white, Latino, and Asian. Some facts. So the working class has become a very diverse group. Once upon a time, 80+% were white. Now about 60% are white. 20% are black, and about 20% are black, and about 20% are Hispanic. Number two, fewer and fewer of them are working. Between 1980 and 2016, the employment rate among working class men dropped from 81% to 74%. It's coming back up now a bit in good times, but it's still not a good number. Number three, and this was one of our most striking findings, marriage has declined faster, more in the working class than in any other group in America in recent decades. Over the last 4 decades, from 3/4 to half of the working class are now getting married. And civic engagement is also a really troubling story. The working class was once more engaged than any other Americans in their rotaries and unions and churches and what have you. And in recent years, the bottom has just fallen out. 15% participate annually in any kind of group, basically none. So bottom line here, and another way of putting this, the working class used to look a lot like the middle class, only they just didn't quite earn as much. Now they're starting to look more and more like the poor. And there's a lot to be said about why. Ryan touched on some of the topics. They've been hit harder by globalization than other Americans. Most of us have benefited. Their jobs have disappeared or moved overseas. But they've also been ignored, and this is one of our bigger points that we try to address, by policymakers. For nearly 2 generations, policymakers have been finding ways to help every group in America except the working class. I've come to see the working class as the hole in the donut. They're not well off enough for most means-tested, they're too well off, for most means-tested government benefits, but they're not well off enough for many tax deductions and other middle-class benefits. So we could talk more about that, and we could argue about it, but I'm going to follow my instructions and move on to our proposals. So I'm going to just say make a few general points about our proposals. The central theme is work. We have 36 recommendations on everything from unions to child care, but they're all driven by one core principle: work. Draw people who've dropped out of the workforce back into the labor market, make work pay, teach people the skills they need to get better jobs, and strengthen family and community to support work. And Bill Galston's going to have a lot more to say about that core idea in a moment. Number 2, our recommendations are budget neutral. We found a way to pay for everything without adding to the deficit, and I'll give an example of how we did it in a moment. Number 3, we rejected several big ideological, for want of a better word, bumper sticker solutions: universal basic income, free college, Medicare for all, a global trade war, or a wall on the border. We think all those things would make the problem worse, not better. And 4, one last important theme: right and left, we agree that this group of Americans should get a fairer deal. The approach to public policy that has helped everyone except them isn't right, and we suggest a number of ways to rectify that. So I'm going to use most of my time to talk about one of those ways, our proposals on education and skills. Because our group believes that nothing would do more to expand opportunity for the working class than more of the right kind of education and skills. And our shared assumption was that we need a true alternative to college. Don't get me wrong, college is great. True alternative to traditional academic 4-year college, right? College is great. If you finish college, there's a big payoff. But many students don't finish, or they study the wrong thing, very, very bad mistake. Or they obviously take out big loans and end up worse off rather than better off. And this is a problem across America. Families across America are wrestling with the question, is college worth it? But the need for a better alternative is especially acute in the working class for 2 reasons. People whose fathers could make a good life with nothing but high school can't pull that off anymore. Pretty much everybody needs something more than high school today, but if not 4-year college, what? And number two, people who lose their factory job at 38 or 42 and need to retool are not going to go back to a classroom to get a degree that requires them to, years, and they have to learn grammar and history along with the skills they need for the job. So people in both these circumstances need a better alternative. And there is good news. There are a lot of people across the country wrestling with that problem. A lot of ferment, a lot of experimentation, new programs, new connections between programs, alternative credentialing. 1,000 flowers are blooming. I sometimes like to compare it to Silicon Valley in the 1970s. The excitement and the experimentation, the innovation. But the problem is it's still the 1970s. The new computers aren't available to everybody yet, and we're still working on the iPhone. So that's the challenge we address in the Education and Skills chapter. How do we use policy to spur the emergence of a true alternative to four-year college? And we have a number of ideas. We have suggestions for educators and employers and state policymakers in Washington. But our most dramatic proposals are about money, federal spending on higher education. And the point about federal higher ed spending is that it isn't keeping up with all that exciting innovation and experimentation going on around the country. The overwhelming lion's share of higher ed dollars still go to students taking traditional academic courses at traditional academic colleges and universities. And the numbers are stark. I should have a slide. The U.S. spends $139 billion a year on higher ed. 120 billion of that go to traditional academic education, and just 19 billion go to occupational or career education. That's 14%. And I don't know what the balance is, but I don't think it's 14%. So we propose to change this. We want to make more federal financial aid available to career-focused programs. And I think in and of itself, that idea makes sense to a lot of people, but they're two hard questions, right? Number one, how do you ensure quality control? We don't want to have another for-profit debacle. And number two, where to find the money to make it available for a much broader category of people. So we can talk about quality control in the conversation if you're interested, but I think the harder question is where to find the money. And we wrestled long and hard with that in our group because we did really want to be budget neutral. And in the end, our proposals are informed by the imbalance I talked about earlier. For 2 generations, maybe more, politicians have been helping every other group. And that's especially true on education. We've been helping the middle class with a variety of tax breaks and subsidies. And our group proposes to remedy that imbalance by taking money away from 3 different pots of higher ed spending that now go mostly to the middle and upper middle class, and using that money to pay for job-focused alternatives to four-year college. So, we eliminate tax-advantaged 529 savings accounts. Almost all 529s belong to better-off families. The families in the top fifth of the income scale get 97% of the benefits of 529s, while poor and working-class families see really no gain at all. Number 2, we eliminate loan forgiveness for graduate students. Graduate students already have bachelor's degrees, something they can use to get a loan. Most, especially the biggest borrowers, attend elite professional schools, law schools and medical schools. They're heading to a lifetime of elite professional earnings. They can borrow from banks. They should borrow from banks. The taxpayer doesn't need to be subsidizing them. And number 3, we make significant adjustments to education tax credits. Research shows the tax credits do nothing to increase college going, and they too benefit primarily better off families. Families earning up to $180,000 a year are eligible for the American Opportunity Tax Credit for undergraduates, but most low-income students don't benefit because their families, they don't pay tuition or their families don't pay taxes. So we propose lowering that $180,000 income ceiling to $100,000. And we think each of these proposals would eliminate an upper middle class subsidy, but preserve aid for the middle class, and together they would free up a lot of money for job-focused education. So I'm almost out of time. I need to wrap up, but there are a lot of other proposals in the report that I like, and I want to just tick off 3 very quickly. Number 1, we found a bipartisan way to pay for expanding the EITC. Now to childless workers. Now that's a popular idea, of course. President Obama liked it, Paul Ryan liked it, but the left and right have never been able to figure out a way to pay for it. We found a bipartisan way to pay for that expansion. Number two, we gave a lot of thought to opportunity zones. We're bullish on opportunity zones, or certainly hopeful about them, but we're not sure they'll work to expand opportunity unless local communities step up to the plate and supplement the incoming financial capital that the measure will drive with parallel coordinated investments in the zone's human and social capital. And number three, we want public assistance programs to do more to help beneficiaries get back to work. This was the issue we as a group argued the most about, so maybe I'll leave it to the discussion. I know Robert has a lot to say about it. But in closing, I'll come back to what I see as one of our most important themes. The working class has been left out, and that needs to change. That doesn't mean the answer is a bunch of big new government programs. There's some answers need to come from the government, federal government, but also very importantly, state and local government. Some answers need to come from the private sectors. Many answers, in fact, need to come from the private sector, and some should come from within working class communities. But the status quo that's weighted so heavily against the working class isn't right, and it's time for all of us to give more thought to how to rectify that. All right, and now I'll pass the baton to Bill Galston.
Well, let me begin with some thank yous. First of all, to Ryan Streeter for hosting this event and for giving us cheerful leadership throughout this very long process. To the person who preceded me at the podium, to Margie Kobe, whose unswerving determination through a sea of troubles, finally brought this project to safe harbor. And finally, and I will precede my third thank you with a quotation from the Gospel of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, his famous statement that we're all entitled to our own opinions, but not to our own facts. I think it is possible that many of you will read this report and disagree with many of its recommendations. But I'm proud that under the leadership of Ron Haskins, we started off with, I think, a truly groundbreaking facts chapter, followed by a nifty maps chapter that answers in an organized and concise way many of the key factual questions about the status of the working class. And I think all of the people who participated in this report believe that the conversation about policy responses should be framed and constrained by careful attention to the actual facts of the situation. It is possible to state those facts shorn of ideological biases and prisms, and I encourage you all to spend to devote special attention to those opening chapters. Let me just make a handful of points very quickly. As Tamar said, we had an organizing principle for this report, the centrality of work, central as a basis of structure in our lives, central as a very tangible token of our commitment to make a contribution to our own support, to our families, and to our communities. Last, but certainly not least, as a source of dignity and pride. And it is within that context that the declining labor force participation rate in the working class, especially among working class men, is of particular concern. This is not just an economic issue. This is a social issue and a moral issue and a deeply human issue. People shorn of dignity and pride are likely to succumb to despair. And as you may have seen on the front page of the national newspapers this morning, life expectancy in the United States has once again declined. This is a very good summary of the overall health of a society, and I'm afraid we are flunking that test. So that's point number one. Point number two, based on that organizing principle, the overall objective of our report was to create a new social contract of shared responsibility for an economy of work and a culture of work. And by shared responsibility, we mean just that. Responsibility incumbent on individuals to do the best they can to support themselves, their families, and to contribute to their communities. The private sector has a very important responsibility, particularly in the area of skills, and it is our judgment that the private sector has not fully lived up to that responsibility in the past generation, and we call upon the private sector to do more in various ways throughout this report. Third, the public sector. This will, the improvement of the status of the working class will not occur without smart, carefully tailored, but robust public sector involvement. And fourth, civil society. We have a chapter in the report that focuses on the distinctive contribution that civil society organizations can make to the renewal of the working class, person by person, but also working class communities. Point 3, how are we going to do this? I'll break it down as follows. There is an expectation of work for those who are able to do so, and we propose to not only declare this expectation, but encourage it through, for example, a restructuring of the unemployment insurance program to encourage people who are unemployed to make the transition to work as quickly as possible. And as Tamar indicated, we also call for taking work requirements more seriously, not in all programs, but in selected programs, and we broke out SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, for special attention in this connection. Second, the opportunity to work. And we try to underscore this by calling for high employment macroeconomic policies, by endorsing opportunity zones, and even, and this may surprise some people, reaching bipartisan consensus on the need for, or the possible need for, private sector job subsidies to create jobs of last resort in order to allow people to meet the expectation of work. Third, the ability to work. This involves, first and foremost, the kind of comprehensive program of skills training that Tamar just outlined, but it also involves a removal of impediments to work, such as substance abuse, and also the absence of child care. And we call for more robust programs in both of those areas. Fourth, a reward for work. And in this connection, we call for a doubling of the earned income tax credit for childless workers, and the calculation of EITC payments on the basis of individual as opposed to, at present, household earnings. Both of these innovations will substantially improve the economic prospects of childless working class workers without cutting into the EITC as a source of family support. And also, we call in addition for wage subsidy pilot programs. There are arguments to the effect that a well-crafted program of wage subsidies would be more user-friendly for many working class workers. Fourth and finally, the key premise underlying expanded public sector involvement in this area is this. I'll state it in the language of economists, that work has positive externalities for families and for society and for individuals, not fully captured in wages earned and taxes paid. And a classic justification for intervention to increase the supply of something is when the social value of that thing is not fully captured in the private value of that thing. We believe that work is a classic example of a human activity with positive externalities. We need more of it. We need to make it as universal as possible. It is the best possible way to restore the working class of the United States to the health and dignity that it deserves, but of which it has been deprived for much too long. And once again, thank you.
Go.
Very nice, Bill.
So that was both Tamar and Bill and Ryan. That's an outstanding start to our discussion. I'm Robert Dorr. I'm the Morgridge Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI. I was on the group that wrote the report. I really appreciate, Bill, your calling out Dr. Haskins, because you're absolutely right about his tremendous work on this. But I think Ann Kim is also here from the Progressive Policy Institute. She was a member of our team. It was a great group, and Tamar, you were to be credited for keeping us together as best you could over the years. So this part of the discussion is meant to be an opportunity for two observers of our work and reviewers of our work from both, excuse me for saying this, right and left, to comment on sort of how you think this will be received from your respective tribes, and let us know what you think we could have done better or what you think is good about it. So I'm going to start with you, Ben. But before I turn it over to you, Ben, I got to introduce you. Ben Harris is the chief economist and senior advisor at Results for America and the former chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. He's also a visiting associate professor at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, and he was previously the policy director of the Hamilton Project, a fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, and a deputy director of the Retirement Security Project at Brookings. Ben, it's great to have you. We also have someone who's been here frequently, Scott Winship, who is the director of the Social Capital Project, an initiative created by Senator Mike Lee as vice chairman of the United States Congress's Joint Economic Committee. Previously, he was the Walter B. Wriston Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a fellow at the Brookings Institution as well. Dr. Winship has testified before Congress on the issues of poverty, inequality, and employment, and he served as an advisor to Governor Jeb Bush's 2016 presidential campaign. Scott, great to have you back. Ben, start us off. How do you respond to this report?
So, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. Let me start by saying I know it makes for better theater if I came out and said I didn't like this report. I love this report. I know that it makes the next hour more boring, but this report. Here's why I like this report so much. First, this report was written in a nonpartisan way. You can't read this report and say, look, I think this was written by Republicans. I think it was written by Democrats. It is evidence-based. It's clear. Based in fact, and it just takes politics out of the equation. And it is amazing what you can accomplish if you take politics out of the equation. This report is written by people who actually want to see something get done. And you have a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, a Republican president. The only way you're helping this group of people, the working class, is if you start from a place of being nonpartisan. And so I think that's one of the most powerful things the report does. The report is also brave. I mean, it takes some stances which are pretty forward-looking, which are pretty much out there. It endorses TPP. It calls for cutting back on 529s, which is small but still controversial. It talks about monetary policy and the need to better protect working Americans. It takes a stance on immigration, not a policy stance, but a general stance on immigration that is not the enemy of this group of people. And so this is a really forward-leaning report. It actually has a line which is kind of buried, which I think is it's a radical line. And it says, management should see workers not just as an input to be purchased at a lower cost, but also allies to be invested in to the end of greater production and income for all. So what you're basically saying is we need to step away from this 60, 70-year view that companies are beholden only to shareholders. This is a really radical point of view. I mean, you could read this report and not pick up on that, but it is this notion that companies do have a responsibility to their workers, do have a responsibility to their communities, not just their shareholders. This is a perfectly debatable point, but it is radical. So I appreciate the report. I think in many ways was brave. The report is also incremental. And Tamar said this at the beginning. There is not one giant silver bullet which will solve all of the woes of this group. I think that if you're being realistic, it is an incremental approach. There are, dozens of different policy recommendations which collectively make a huge difference. We don't need a UBI to solve these problems. I'm not a fan of UBI. This report is not a fan of UBI, and I very much think the incremental approach is better. And lastly, I'll iterate, there are a lot of facts in here. There are a lot of terrific facts, and it's just well justified. So Coming from a person who fully endorses evidence-based policy, I'm very encouraged by this report. Quickly to the I have 2 more minutes? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're doing so well.
So on the policies, the report doubles down on work, and it does it in a comprehensive way. It doesn't just talk about work requirements. It doesn't just talk about wage subsidies. It doesn't just talk about how we need to have better quality jobs. It takes a truly comprehensive view about what work should be. Work should be something that people better themselves, they have dignity in, they can earn enough money to support a family, where they cooperate with management, where they have various protections around the competitiveness of the labor market. So this report doesn't just take one view around work, it takes a very comprehensive view, which I think is powerful. It also embraces the power of the tax code. So many of these policies are tax-based. They call for an expansion of the EITC. That's tax-based. It does the pay for with the cutting back on tax expenditures. That's tax-based. Even the opportunity zones, that is ultimately it's a cut on capital gains tax. So I think so much of this policy in our country is made through the tax code, whether you're talking about health or retirement or homeownership, and I think the report generally embraces that, which I think is incredibly powerful. A few things which I would have done differently. So first, even though there's the discussion about the role of wealth, the policies are not well targeted towards wealth building. And I think there's a real opportunity, particularly through the tax code, to have better targeted policies towards this group. The mortgage interest deduction, which was cut back a little bit by the TCJA, but is still at least $30 billion a year, that's just for the deduction on mortgage interest, is a terrible way to subsidize homeownership, and it's a terrible way to subsidize homeownership for this group. There are very few itemizers in this group, if any. And so people like me get subsidies to buy bigger homes, whereas the 15 million or so people in this group get virtually nothing. It's a really poorly designed subsidy. It could be changed. Retirement security contributions. Our country spends at least $200 billion a year subsidizing retirement. That's a good thing. It's a good thing that we have, that people accumulate capital throughout their lives, both for their retirement well-being, but also for investment. But the way the subsidies are designed for retirement almost go entirely to people in the top quintile. This group misses out on almost all those benefits. That could be changed. So I think this report could focus a little better on wealth building. Also, the report makes a strong case for evidence-based policy. For place-based policy. So investments in various locations, which is something we've done for decades in this country. I've just reviewed this book, which is an 800-page exhaustive review, and did not appreciate how long a history our country has in trying to subsidize economic and community development. If you think this is a big problem, which I do, then you've got to go bigger than opportunity zones. Opportunity zones were a $1.5 billion investment over 10 years. That was $1 out of every $1,000 in the TCJA went towards place-based policy. If you think this is a big problem, we need a bigger solution than $1.5 billion. And I wish the report would have gone a little bigger on that. And lastly, since I'm representing the left here, and also I believe this, I don't like the work requirements for SNAP. And you go, I almost embrace everything else in the report around work, but you have, here's how I look at it. I'm curious to hear what Scott and others have to say on this. You have a chart here, and I'll stop, that explains why people, sorry, honestly.
Okay.
It says, ask people why they aren't working if you're out of work. And 4% of people say it's because they don't want to. So why punish the 19 out of 20 people who do want to work, but either have to take time off for caregiving or can't find a job, or have what would be pretty legitimate reasons for not working, to penalize the 5% who are just lazy? That's a genuine question, and I'll stop there.
We will answer that in a minute. Scott, thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Robert. Pleasure to be here with such great folks on this panel. I should say at the outset that nothing that I'm going to say is in my capacity as being on the Social Capital Project or in the Joint Economic Committee or working for Senator Mike Lee. That out of the way. First, just want to congratulate everybody who was involved in the process. I think it's a great report. I've been involved, I've had a little bit of experience in being involved in some of these projects before, and they are rough. It's a real eye-opener just in terms of, I think, how little we know when you get down to certain details. and how much room it leaves for ideology. And so even among grown adults who are smart and like to think of ourselves as very critical thinkers, there are 1,000,001 opportunities for people to say, yeah, that's true, but it might be that this is going on. And these efforts are really no less polarized than any efforts on the Hill to get policy written. And so I think any time a report comes out that manages to get a bunch of people endorsing it from both sides is really impressive. It's impressive as deficit neutral. I think that's a very big deal. It's got a lot of, I think, really innovative stuff. That's the other thing. It's not a milquetoast sort of least common denominator kind of report of kind of a boring laundry list. There's opportunity zones, occupational licensing and non-competes, UI reform, child support enforcement, new post-secondary models, and credentialing. So a bunch of really neat stuff that I think, by the way, would also help working class people. So that's another bonus. Let's see. I've got some quibbles, but probably the thing that I am probably going to be the outlier on, I think, in terms of not being a fan of something in the report, is its characterization of sort of economic trends, I guess. So I think the report is coming out at a really interesting moment where both left and right are trying to figure out. I think there's a movie coming out called What Men Want, right? The sequel. What does the white working class want? The report does a very good job of saying this is not a report about the white working class specifically, but I think politically what's driving all of this is people are trying to figure out what does the white middle class want. And that's on both sides, I think, kind of turned into a debate between sort of economic populism on the one hand and sort of more moderation on the other, I guess, on the left. Which I was familiar with once and I'm less familiar with now. It seems to be, as far as I can tell, sort of third way in the Progressive Policy Institute against the world. On the right, it's sort of the Trumpian wing of the Republican Party versus a few of us Reformicons sort of sitting off the side going, hey, could I say something? And largely being ignored. And so I think everyone's trying to figure out in this moment what's going on. And that really turns on what the nature is of the decline that we're worried about. What's the nature of the crisis that we have? Is it primarily economic or is it primarily cultural or something that is related to economics but more than economics? That debate, in turn, hinges on the evidence that we're using to look at trends over time, for instance, to interpret things like the decline in male labor force participation. And my view, and I'm arguing intermittently online with Oren Cass and some others, I'm sort of constantly arguing with people online about this, I guess, is that there's a fair amount of stagnation, but there's not a lot of evidence for decline, I would argue, for economic decline. So the report, I think, has a chart that shows that pay has risen by about 10% between 1979 and 2017, roughly. And that's a chart that mixes men and women. It mixes immigrants and non-immigrants. I've sort of tried to look at things broken up a little bit, and when I do that, I find that hourly compensation is higher for non-Hispanic whites, 2017 versus 1973, by about a third. For blacks and Hispanics, it's about a quarter. If you go down to more like the 20th percentile, so if you lower down the ladder, it's about a 20% increase for everybody. Those numbers are better than what you generally hear. Why? There's some technical details that no one wants to hear about. But a big reason why is they combine men and women. And the stagnation story is really about men's pay stagnating. And that's a really important point to keep in mind because we do not have stagnation among working class women. Their pay has gone up something like 50% at the median. And so a big part of the story, in my view, is this revolution in terms of women working, what impact that's had on men's wages, on the jobs they take, on how important they feel like it is to stay in a job they don't like, to make the maximum pay possible because they've got families to support. As the safety net becomes more and more generous over time, men aren't as necessary in a lot of ways. And I think much of the decline that we're worried about, whether it's opioids, whether it's family decline, whether it's community social capital disinvestment, is at least as much a function of our becoming more affluent than it is a function of our becoming less affluent. We don't need each other as much as we used to. We can pay for it on the market. We can get paid childcare. We don't need the neighbors to take care of our kids. We have a big safety net that can support a woman with children, not lavishly by any stretch, but enough that cobbling together other resources, you don't need to marry anymore. And I think a lot of our crisis is really a social one rather than an economic one. I'll stop there.
Okay, that was great. I want to give Tamar and Bill an opportunity to respond. Anything that either one of Ben or Scott said that you want to take off on or go with?
No, thank you.
Thank you. We'll take that as it is.
Yeah. Why complain?
Bill?
I'll go a little farther. First of all, for Ben, I think your list of omissions or missed opportunities in this report is a very sensible one, and I can't speak for the entire group, but I think that people interested in this topic should take your suggestions on board, and indeed, I would add one in my own name. I don't think we gave enough emphasis to the importance of post-felony employment. Opioid addiction is one important barrier to employment that is often cited. The other is a criminal record. And it is, I think, self-defeating for us as a society to expect people who get out of prison to be self-supporting and then have an employment system that makes it extraordinarily difficult for them to re-enter the world of the paid workforce. And I know this has been a topic of considerable discussion on the left, but I think that it should be a topic of considerable discussion for all of us. I'm encouraged to see the growth of a bipartisan movement for criminal justice reform. It's been focused on sentencing up to now, but I think it ought to broaden its focus to include economic reentry programs. So that's my first response. My second response to Ben is that is sort of a footnote. I absolutely agree with you about the importance of place-based policies, and it may interest you to learn that a trio of Brookings scholars, of whom I'm one, just last week came out with a comprehensive report on place-based policies to address the problems of neglected areas and neglected people in these areas, some of whom are poor, many of whom are working class. And if you give me your email afterwards, I'll be happy to send this.
I look forward to it.
And you'll be happy to hear that it's not 800 pages. It's more like 40. I guess my third response is to ask Robert Doar
I'm ready.
to offer a response.
I'll tell you that story.
Offer a response
Yes.
then on the on the
So-
SNAP issue. But here's my fourth point. I should have put them in reverse. I should have put them in reverse order. I think, Scott, you're on to something when you're talking about this as more a crisis among the male members of the working class. I think that, and there's been a lot of qualitative research on that issue. And I don't think we shy away from that. As a matter of fact, in many of the charts, we break out men and women, and it's perfectly clear that, for example, labor force participation is not a crisis among working class women, but it certainly is among working class men, et cetera. We can have a robust debate as to whether that is principally a social and cultural phenomenon or whether it has more economic underpinnings than your account lets on. One of the important features of this report is that we decided not to enter into that debate, right? That liberals will say that economics is upstream and culture is downstream. Conservatives will say just the reverse. But at a certain point, you have a tangle of pathologies that you cannot disentangle. You can try to do multivariate analysis and a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but in fact, you have these two things reinforcing each other. And so at that point, you have to attack on all fronts because you can no longer pull out just one strand.
So I didn't know we had a chance to say the other things we thought were left out. So after we finished this report, we went on a trip to the Heartland. We called it a listening tour, and we went to 2 places and spent several days in each place talking to people in the place about which of our 3 dozen recommendations resonated with them and made sense. And I learned 2 things that we really left out. We didn't talk enough about civic leadership. The Opportunity Zone proposals are really about civic leadership. It's about the people in the community coming together to plan and coordinate and have a vision of their place. But we could have made much more of a meal of that. That's really the difference between places that are succeeding in the Heartland and the places that are not succeeding. It has a lot to do with civic leadership. And the other, it's a smaller piece, but it's very important, and it goes to this issue of the women working. Transportation is a huge issue. Getting from where people live to where the jobs are, which didn't seem that important to me when we were kind of in the room here. When you get out there, it's really important to a lot of people, and it's something policy could solve. Since we get our own doubts.
On the work requirements, it comes a lot from my perspective of having run the SNAP program in both New York City and New York State, and which has become over many years a program that's been indifferent to the lack of work for recipients who could work. The message that the SNAP program has heard is helping an individual who applies and says they have no earnings but could have earnings. They're not disabled, they're not seniors, they're not children, is to say that's not my job. And I think if you're going to focus on the centrality of work and you have a major program costing $70 billion a year and serving 40 million Americans, and 8 million of those Americans who are receiving the benefit say, I have no earnings, but I could work, to say to that program, you should be indifferent to helping them get a job is a mistake. So the requirement applies to the program as much as it does to the individual. Right now, the program does not have a requirement to make work a part of their priority for these individuals, and it should. We wholeheartedly endorse that. And then when you come to doing that, the fact is that that's going to involve various processes, calling people in and discussing, making a referral to an employment services program, talking to them about work, maybe engaging them in what would be called case management. And sometimes that requires the recipient of assistance to do things. And if they don't do them, that might lead to a reduction in their benefit. In my judgment, I ran, frankly, I think maybe the biggest SNAP program of any municipality in the country. I'm all for providing food assistance to Americans in need. But the fact is that SNAP and Medicaid alone are not sufficient to bring families above the poverty line unless it is supplemented with some earnings at least. And there's a great opportunity in our economy now, and we felt that the program should not be indifferent to this thing that we think is central to helping this group move up. I should also point out that it was concerned me a little bit that we would be saying to the working class who receive public assistance benefits, we're not going to talk to you about work or getting a job because, I don't know, you're better or different. Where with people that are coming into really the poverty programs, the TANF program, for instance, there we say, we need to get you to work quickly. And I didn't want to have that inequity. I wanted everybody treated the same. Work is important. If you're seeking assistance and you don't have a job, we want to help you get a job. And that is, I think, what ultimately carried the day for the group, and I think is reasonable. And again, having run the program, the fact that it has been indifferent to employment for a subset of its population has, I think, been a lost opportunity.
Can I put up asterisk?
Yes.
How big the subset is. I mean, it's because we're talking about it. It could sound like everybody in the working class is getting food stamps or Medicaid. It's 15% of each. So, they are between the middle class. You look at the chart, what kind of benefits do the middle class get? And we have some nice charts. Angela Rashidi from AEI did some really nice work for us on this. The middle class, I'm not going to remember the percentages, but is not getting very much. The poor is getting a lot. The working class is in between, and it's Medicaid and food stamps, where
Yes.
about 15%.
So just while we're on work requirements, one of the small criticisms I have of the policies, I think, and work requirements ends up being a stickler for these sorts of things. The way that it was finessed is that there's work requirements, but there's a job guarantee, a job of last resort at the end. And I would just put out there that may be a worse policy than no work requirements, or a worse policy than work requirements without jobs of last resort at the end. Because if you're telling a bunch of people who are struggling to some extent on the labor market that if they just join SNAP, there's a job waiting for them, and you get SNAP. And by the way, if you reform these programs, as the report advocates, which I also advocate, to remove marriage penalties, you can also stay married or get married and get a job and get SNAP. That has the potential for some real unforeseen consequences, I think.
It is true that if you offer a recipient of certain benefits a job that's convenient to them, that's available, that pays a low wage, but a wage that's acceptable, often they will say, I'd rather not. And my view is there should be a consequence for that failure to take advantage of an opportunity. So let's go on to one other thing that's in the news right now. I mean, the next couple weeks. We've had a couple dueling op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, Martin Feldstein and Jason Furman. We're not, it's not a group heavily laden with economists, but we seem to say we don't want interest rates to rise too quickly, God forbid throwing ourselves in with a certain person who lives at the White House. Does everybody agree that, though, we shouldn't raise interest rates in December?
I definitely do. I'm not a macroeconomist by any stretch, but I mean, you look at the 1990s wage growth, and that's the whole story of things getting better since the 1980s is 8 years in the 1990s, and it was because Greenspan let things ride a little bit, and wages went up, and I hope we'll do something similar this time around. And wages are rising, have been for a few years now, and I think if we play our cards right, in a decade, we'll be talking about the same sort of period of wage growth that we had in the 90s.
So I agree that wage growth solves so many of these problems, and it does feel like we are right smack in the middle of a once-in-a-20-year opportunity to see wages finally rise appreciably. That being said, I don't think it's all a macro story. When I was at the White House, I had 2 stints with the Obama White House, the last 2 years as Joe Biden's chief economist. I pushed as hard as I could, without getting fired, on labor market competition. And this is the notion that the notion that we have a competitive labor market is entirely a myth. Economists look at competitive labor markets as one where you have full information about what you're worth, and you have frictionless opportunity to pick up your job and move to another one if you're not being paid what you're worth. Under this situation, if employers overpay you, then more people will just go to that employer and it gets driven down the market wage. Our labor market looks nothing like this. So this report actually does a pretty good job of addressing some of these frictions to labor market competition. It takes on occupational licensing. It talks about non-competes. It could go further. It could talk about wage transparency. A quarter of workers report that they feel like they cannot talk about their wages at work without getting punished, even though 15 states and the FLSA prohibit that. It could talk about no poaching agreements. But so, I do think that, to get back to your original question, that I do think we need to take advantage of this opportunity, keep things loose for a while to allow wages to push up, but it's so much more than that.
Okay.
Yep.
Bill?
Yeah, I think I would be on the side of restraint in interest rate increases, given the fact that evidence of inflationary pressures is quite limited at this point, and equivocal. I would make a couple. I'm not an economist either, but I'm going to play one for a minute. On the one hand, on the other hand, Harry Truman's famous complaint, well, nobody send me a one-handed economist. So the economist came up with a clear position, and this non-economist is going to do something. First of all, we have seen that asset price inflation often ends badly with spillover effects for the real economy. And I think that was Mr. Greenspan's biggest mistake. He probably thinks it was his biggest mistake. And that to the extent that we can avoid a repetition of that rather damaging cycle, it would be a very, very good idea. It's pretty clear to me as an amateur observer that the extended low interest rate regime has led to various asset price distortions in the economy, and if they're unwound gradually, that's one thing. If they wind down step functionally, with a big crash in asset prices, something like what's happened to Bitcoin, for example, that would not be a pretty picture. Here's my second point, and maybe this is a sort of a Jared Bernstein memorial point. I think that there is something structurally wrong with the economy if noticeable wage increases only occur when unemployment is at or even below what the Fed defines as full employment. You should not have to have 3.7% unemployment in order for workers to enjoy some of the fruits of aggregate economic growth. I know there's a controversy about this, but in the report, we reproduce the standard chart about the labor share of the total national product, and I think it is unmistakable that that share has declined, and I know Scott is going to give me a very technical argument as to why those standard BLS statistics are a myth. I think it's real. I think that it is just obvious through inspection of the world around us that returns on capital have accelerated during the past generation at labor's expense. And so I do think, and this was not part of the remit of this, of this particular group, but I think there's some broad questions to be asked here about the bargaining power, assuming that labor and capital working together produce a cooperation surplus. How is that surplus to be divided? And I think that the relative weight and bargaining power of the two people at the opposite ends of the seesaw has changed to the disadvantage of average workers in the past generation. Okay, I've just revealed my inner liberal.
Yeah. Scott, you want to comment on that?
Just very quickly, because it will get
Technical quickly.
So when you look at labor share of income, which is technically how much national income goes to workers versus elsewhere, elsewhere also includes depreciation, which is just replacing equipment. When companies replace equipment, that makes workers more productive, and so some of the gains from that go to workers, some go to corporations. But what the chart does is it assigns all of that to something that's not going to workers. Similarly, imputed rents of people who own their own homes, which is a very technical, weird thing. The idea being that you get this flow of services by owning a home that you would otherwise have to pay a landlord rent on. That is also included in the things that do not go to labor. And so these two things both increase over time, and that makes labor's share of the whole get smaller over time. There's a couple other small details with it, but this is a point that actually I think is way less controversial than it ought to be. Larry Summers, Jason Furman, Dean Baker, I think at CEPR wouldn't disagree with me. It's widely misunderstood even among academic economists, but it shouldn't be.
Tamar, I wanted to ask you about our follow-up on the trips, because I went on them too, and one of our principal big recommendations is increasing the childless EITC and then piloting a more direct wage subsidy. It struck me that when we were out in communities and talked to people, and when we said, here's our answer, it's a transfer payment to top up your wages through the earned income tax credit, didn't get that great a response.
No,
Tell
I
me
agree
a little
with
bit
you.
about
I
that.
agree with you, It didn't. I mean, we didn't meet, in prior trips when we were writing the report, we actually met real working class people. In these later trips, we met mostly civic leadership, right? So it is sort of important distinction. I don't know if we'd asked real people, we're going to give you a little more money. But even real people, I think when we brooded when we advanced that idea earlier on, it was not the most exciting.
Well, the way I viewed it is that they said, I'd rather have higher wages than a...
No, I agree.
Which
And
you can't really argue with. I mean, I
No.
sort of get the point.
Yeah, but I think the civic leadership, I mean, the places where we found vitality, they weren't looking to federal policy that much. They were, the places that are thriving are places that said, we're going to stop begging Congress, and the feds probably aren't going to help us, and we're going to get together and solve it here. And so I'm not sure the nonchalance about EITC, which we did see very clearly, was so much about we think it's a bad idea, just like that's, we're focused on something else.
We did see in a couple places, and I've heard more of it since then, there is a lot of activity in training and in apprenticeships and in select areas where partnerships outside of the workforce investment boards or the formal workforce world have been developed between employers and training programs that have developed a sort of alternative to raising your skills. And I think our report wouldn't say it's the world is barren of that. It's out there. We just want more of it.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean by Silicon Valley in the 1970s. There's a garage on every corner. In every city, there are people experimenting with what can the community college do and what can the employers do and how can they get together and how can we fix CTE in the schools. I mean, it's a burgeoning ferment. But I think there can be more. I think we're in Silicon Valley in the 70s, and I think there can be refinements and shakeouts and more done, and employers can do more.
Mm-hmm.
Bill?
Yes, 2 points. First of all, I think it's a source of constant frustration. It's a source of constant frustration that the best practices, to use the jargon of the trade, don't generalize more than they do spontaneously. And one of the things that we do in this report is to try to set in motion not only a discussion but some programs to increase the odds that the areas that are doing it right will turn out to be genuine models for the rest of the country. Because assuming that there'll be a spontaneous spread of what's going right in local communities has been, I think, a hopeful folly of the policy community now for at least 2 generations. It does not work that way. Localities and states can work as laboratories for democracy, but the generalization of good practices usually depends in the end on some national framework within which those good practices are made normative for the society as a whole. That's point number 1. With regard to the response to the EITC, I think history and psychology matter a lot here. You can look it up, folks. Between 1990 and 2000, the number of manufacturing jobs in the society remained about flat. And then in the next 10 years, we lost 5.3 million manufacturing jobs, and we've gotten a little less than 1 million of them back. The expectations for good jobs at good wages are anchored in the working class's historical experience of the manufacturing economy. I wish that we had a wand that we could wave to bring back those jobs at those wages and those benefits and that stability. There is no such wand, and we've been flailing now for a generation to invent it. And I think one of the realistic conclusions of this report is that there's no magic wand, there's no silver bullet, that getting back what used to be the core of the working class working experience is going to be a very arduous process. And it's going to involve a different mix of the private sector and the public sector in providing not only income but also jobs to members of that sector of society. And that's not a conclusion that I welcome, but neither is it a conclusion that I can avoid, and I don't think any other members of the group could either.
But I agree with Robert that people in these places would much rather, they're still focused on getting that job back.
Of
They
course,
still think the wand
that's,
is coming.
But that's the problem that we have, that's not possible.
Yeah.
Right? And we are in an awkward transition period where people's expectations of the future are still anchored in the past.
MAGA, Bill. MAGA.
Yeah, well,
Okay, so there's a little bit of air of us that's sort of all, don't take this wrong, sort of government people and maybe federal government people. But we do have a lot in the report about institutions outside of government.
Yeah.
And one of them is civil society. And you know, Brad Wilcox was on our report. He's one of the great writers about the loss of marriage and other institutions of life that have helped nurture communities. And they're sort of retreating and failing away. And so we call for more of that. But I wonder about that a little bit. It seems to me that the institutions of civil society deserve some blame for this. The churches, the faith-based institutions, they've got to come back too. What do you feel that do you feel frustrated by that? And do you feel that there's a lot of hope for our call for? Give me your answer on that.
I mean, it's the hardest thing for policy to address, right? People not getting married, people not going to church, people not going to the Rotary Club. I mean, what can federal policy do about that? What can local policy do about that? But I think this is where the interaction of economics and culture can take you in the wrong direction, but it can also take you in the right direction. And if more people were working, and if more people were making better wages, and if more people were getting married, and well, marriage is part, it's part of the other side of the equation, but some of that, I think you might see some revitalization of the culture. And I also think that civic leadership is sort of important. I mean, again, in these places where we went, where you could sort of, if you were in the working class, you would sort of feel like the people in your place were sort of in charge and taking you in the right direction, you're going to be more likely to participate in things. You know, it's very much a broken windows problem where when it starts to go bad, it goes bad very quickly. But if it starts to get better, it might get better. And so I think that's one hope. I think another hope, frankly, is immigrants. Immigrant communities are still very cohesive. And the map of the working class was also very interesting. In some places, the cohesion is still very strong. So I'm not as, it is the thing that troubles me the most, the lack of participation in civic engagement and the fraying of those institutions. But I'm not totally pessimistic about, I don't know that exhortation is going to fix it, but I'm not totally pessimistic that other forces might not.
Bill?
well, let me respond to you with a bad news story and a good news story. Okay, a good friend of mine, and I think a friend of many of the people in this room, Wade Horn, during the George W. Bush administration, presided over a robust portfolio of pro-marriage projects. And he honestly had to concede, at the end of the expenditure of some hundreds of millions of dollars, that project really hadn't moved the needle. And that should be a sobering lesson to all of us about the gap between good intentions for the rebuilding of civil institutions and the capacity, let us say, of the public sector, to promote that rebuilding. But here's a good news story, and this also involves my Brookings colleague, Mr. Haskins. In the mid-1990s, a group of refugees from the Clinton administration got together to establish a civil society organization, a 501c3, called the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. We formed because teen pregnancy was at a record high as you remember, in the early and mid-1990s. It was really a national catastrophe. And we assigned ourselves some very ambitious goals over 10 years and 20 years. And we recognized that there was a programmatic component to teen pregnancy reduction, but there was also a cultural normative component. We worked on both of those with equal vigor. The teen pregnancy rate is now down 60% from its highs in the early and mid-1990s. And I think the rallying of civil society, cultural forces, including Hollywood, working carefully with Hollywood script writers to insert stories about teen pregnancy and the consequences of it in the most widely watched weekly television shows in the country, I think the programs and the cultural emphasis put together helped. And I am, I'm not entirely devoid of hope that something that might be called, the civil society version of a Great Awakening might be possible.
All right, well, I want to follow up on that with you two on an element of our calling for a Great Awakening that's in the report very clearly, and that is corporate responsibility toward workers. You mentioned it in your comments. It's in the report. And there's a lot of that out there now, where there's a lot of rhetoric about Amazon or Walmart or even the president now on General Motors, that actions that don't lead to more jobs and higher wages and more training for workers in this group taken by corporations are going to be frowned upon and jawboned and criticized. How do you guys react to that? And we endorse that. I mean, there's a lot in this report that says corporations can do more than they're doing now for their middle-class
Can I
workers.
do a footnote before they answer?
Yes.
We had fights about this, right? There were people in the group who really wanted to go with pitchforks, and there were other people who wanted to go with incentives. And we, I think we struck a balance, but I think it's jawbone and criticize puts it all on the kind of pitchforks. And it's hard to think about. It's a little.
Well, the
more
pitchforks would have been we wanted to pass mandated wages or mandated, and we didn't do as much of that. But what I want to know is does the cultural persuasion forces that Bill said might have played a role in teen pregnancy prevention, and I think it did, can they work in this economy for workers and wages and training?
Well, so let me answer the question I want to answer, which is you're sort of
supposed to say that.
I know, but we're all friends here.
Memo, I care.
So there's what you're seeing right now on corporate culture, which is what you originally asked about. Is I think you are seeing a change. And so you went from a situation coming out of World War II where I think that companies and the executives that led them did feel a fundamental responsibility to the communities and to the workers. Their job was not only to maximize profits, but also to support the communities and the workers with which they interacted. They saw it more as a joint interaction. You'd get with a company, you'd stay for a long time. People felt loyalty to their companies because the companies took care of them. I don't think that's gone. But you had this fundamental shift, which started with a paper that in the 1970s. It was almost more of just like a thought exercise, but everyone glommed onto it that said corporations should just maximize profits. And not necessarily, and I'm not saying this in a derogatory way, but you have a responsibility to your shareholders. Your shareholders are giving you their money. You are the guardian of that investment. You must protect it. You must maximize profits. That's your job. And I think that a lot of executives feel that pressure. But you're starting to see a change. You're starting to see a change both on the investor side. So Larry Fink at BlackRock has come out really strongly against this in annual letters to investors. You're seeing a change from a policy side. So when I was at the Obama White House, Joe Biden made this sort of a key pillar of his economic agenda, which was calling for better strategies for long-termism. And you're starting to see a change among some executive leaders who are saying, look, we do want to take a longer-term view with respect to our investments and our communities. It's really hard to show empirically. It's just one of those things which, you can point to a few different studies, like in finance, that say, look, on the margin, you have executives who are being paid based on the stock performance. So if the stock is just below the strike price, maybe they're more willing to go and share repurchases and things like that. But it's really hard to show empirically. But I think that this change is really important for getting back to the situation, getting back to that quote, which I started at the beginning, which is that management workers need to work together. Management needs to invest in their workers to change the culture around work. We can't just be talking about wages. It has to be the culture of work where people feel empowered, they feel like they have dignity, and they feel like they're partnered with management.
Scott?
Well, I guess I'll say I would love if more employers gave generous benefits to their workers, and I would love if they gave paid leave and if they had flexible hours and telecommuting and any number of other things.
Training.
But I really do sort of worry when we impose mandates on employers, which is a little bit different than sort of browbeating them, I guess. I just think it's almost surely the case that they know better than we do what they can afford to do in the global environment or local environment that they face, and that we start to really take our chances when we start imposing more costs on the people that we also want to provide more jobs. So I tend to shy away from even browbeating them. Honestly, I sort of feel like, you know, it'd be great if more people had the sort of relationships that existed more often in the mid-20th century. But the fact that they don't, I got to believe is a reason for it.
Even browbeating.
Well, and I mean, the other piece of let's be realistic about this, right, is, you know, people are going to change jobs, you know, 13 times in their lives or whatever it is. You know, investing in somebody for a whole career where you expect them to stay and you both get a stake in how the company's going to go, that doesn't happen anymore. Global competition, and we're not talking enough about the difference between corporations and small businesses. I mean, I'm not trying to speak, you know, be the spokesperson for the Chamber of Commerce, but I think that there's many pressures that it's easy for us to sit here in our sort of, you know, halls and say they should be doing differently. I think the answer is I agree. I'm not really for browbeating, and I'm not really for mandates. I am for rewarding the ones who do it right, and not necessarily with money or policy, but with regard. And I think that spreads. I mean, I think I spend a lot of time in my sort of research on training issues out in the heartland in small businesses, and they do care about their employees. There's only so much they can do, but I think we want to reward the people who do it right and create ways for the small guys to come together so they can do more.
The only comment I would make, is being in this world a little bit in my previous life, is that the power of large corporations to move the needle in this is much greater when they do something voluntarily than the power of a particular workforce development program in various communities. I mean,
I agree.
With one move by Walmart or one move by some large entity on any number of these issues, training, paid leave, wages.
But voluntarily is an important word in that.
I got that, but the point is that you know, if it happens, it happens. I think I'm with Scott. I'd much rather it happened absent a mandate, which has all other kinds of downside consequences. But to say that I'm going to forego the opportunity to influence this community because I don't like the sound of brown baiting. I don't get that. Why not? You know?
Well, because let me add a little bit of a footnote. I mean, I think businesses, and again, I learned this in the training world, the upskilling world. Businesses are a lot more enthusiastic about things, and they do them a lot better when they think they're running them.
Yes.
Businesses don't like to be invited to the government table and told to do things. Businesses don't even, you know, businesses will go and be in a community college and be in the policy advisory committee, but they do better when they come together and they say, we need this, and we're going to hire that community college to do it.
And let me say, I was not arguing for a mandate, and I wasn't arguing for browbeating. I was arguing for changing the incentives around how executives are paid, which are entirely pushing executives towards short-term share price. Executives don't like this. I mean, my argument is give them the incentives to do what they want to do, which is to build a business that betters the world. And I know enough executives where I believe that's what they want to do. They're not in it to just make that extra $10 million. They want to change the world, and I think we should change the incentives to allow them to do that.
Well, so how do we change the world between corporate America, the relationship between corporate America and the big funds? That's the critical question. Because it's the big organized investors who are putting pressure on executives and their corporations, and so I think we're talking about a very large structural problem here. But let me retreat from that macro to a point about training. What we're all describing in different ways are competitive pressures that are leading to a suboptimal supply of a public good. In this case, a more trained workforce, right? Because we can all recite the reasons why corporations might not want to make an investment in footloose workers, right? The more skills they have, the more broadly marketable they are, and that might strike a corporate, human relations office as being self-defeating. But if the aggregate consequence of individual rational decisions is the undersupply of an important good, there are some classic ways of leaning against those competitive forces, and I don't see how we can not talk about them. Right? Have I made some error of logic there? I appeal to an economist.
One tiny footnote.
Okay, and then we're going to go to
Increase
questions.
of skill, the need for more and more skilled workers is changing that to a significant degree in a lot of industries, because when you really need somebody skilled to do your job right, which you do as routinization takes over some of the other jobs, I mean, a lot of the companies I see, it's a desperate survival matter to train people some.
Yeah, although you know this world better than I do. I guess I sit at Brookings and listen to corporate leaders complain about the quality of the workforce without ever volunteering to do anything about it.
plenty of
And
that.
it drives me
That's a
crazy.
little
There's plenty of that.
All right, so we have a question in the back. Tim Carney. Yeah, why don't you wait for a mic? You know, we want to make sure every word you say is recorded, because it's going to be brilliant.
You'll be heard
Yeah.
without a mic.
Okay.
Thank you. Tim Carney, AEI, as well as Washington Examiner. You discuss very well how community and family collapse overlap geographically and lots of stuff with the decline in work and skills. I'd like you guys to address how you think the causality of those connections work, and in part, sort of my very quick mini thesis is that the best training historically hasn't been explicitly training, but it's been strong communities. And that's not just schools, but just community, families, neighbors, that sort of thing. So families and communities have been the sort of natural, organic training ground of skills. They've eroded, and so you've actually had not just an economic collapse lead to community collapse, but the causality also goes the other way. But you guys probably have lots more thoughts on the causality.
When we started on this project, that was my burning question. What's the causality? Which way does that economics and culture go? And I think I decided over the course of it, the more you look at it, the harder it is to untangle. So, I used to have a theory that when people lost their manufacturing jobs that paid $25 an hour and went to Wendy's at $9 an hour, that eroded their marriage, and sort of but I don't think it's that simple anymore. I think it really is both things that happened at once. On the skilling, what's missing now is people showing up at work and having an attitude toward work and knowing what it's like to be in a team and respecting a boss. That stuff yes, you're right, the community once taught. But it's also true that jobs out there now require a lot more skill. When you went to the Ford factory, you did not really need to be a trained person. You could follow the guy in front of you and learn how to do it. Now, in manufacturing, you really need to know what you're doing, and it's a very highly skilled job. And I don't think that kind of skill was taught in communities. So the bottom line is I can't answer you, and I think it's really hard to answer. Maybe somebody smarter than me can.
Yeah?
So first of all, I'll take the opportunity to plug Tim's forthcoming book on social capital, which is going to be amazing, I think. When's it come out? January? February. Was not paid to. I'm not violating Senate ethics rules. We're friends. But the answer I would give to that question, I agree that in a lot of cases it's really hard to disentangle. There are cases, though, I think, where it's easier and where we can very clearly disentangle in a very useful way. So take deaths of despair, for instance. The deaths of despair story, 80% of it is a story about the opioid crisis. It doesn't even require that despair has increased, right? Instead, we've had this huge supply increase of prescription opioids first, and then people got addicted to that and ended up, when their prescriptions ran out, trying to get it from family and friends, and eventually trying heroin, and then fentanyl gets mixed in with it and kills a lot of people. If you look at the geographic correlations between where the opioid crisis hit and where social capital indicators look bad, there's very little correlation. The Southeast is pretty much across the board the ugliest place in terms of social capital, regardless of what measure you look at. It's not entirely true, but pretty true. Utah was number one, conveniently, given my boss is the senator from Utah. But other research has confirmed that Utah is sort of up towards the top on social capital indicators as well. The Southeast didn't have much of an opioid crisis. It recently, in the last year or two, it started picking up. But it wasn't, by any means, kind of a hot spot until recently. Utah, on the other hand, where the crisis has kind of peaked, but for a long time it was really bad, has amazing social capital. And a lot of the story just is is orthogonal to social capital. It's how many doctors were prescribing drugs, and in the West, it's what the innovative marketing techniques that the gangs used to sell black tar heroin over there. Similarly, the research sort of trying to link Trump's win to economics, I don't think it's tended to find more often than not that it's not economic factors. There's a great book by John Sides, name of which I'm forgetting, but it's fairly new.
Identity crisis.
Identity crisis, which shows pretty dramatically that we're talking about race. We're talking about sort of racial resentment, cultural anxiety, and most of the research that I've seen about Trump's victory is much more supportive of cultural than economic change.
Okay. John?
John Tomasi from Brown. I read the report just last night, and I'm still digesting it, but it's fascinating. And one section that jumped out at me was in the very middle of the report, and it's only 4 paragraphs long, but it involves works councils. So I'm just very curious to hear more about what you think about the work councils. As several people have noted, one of the radical ideas in the report is this idea that the call for the Great Awakening of corporate responsibility. And it seemed to me that perhaps that call for the Great Awakening of corporate responsibilities was softened by the inclusion of those 4 paragraphs advocating changes in the labor law for works councils. And I have 2 questions. So one is I'm just curious, is the idea shared across the committee that a less adversarial approach might be beneficial to workers? That's my first question. I'm especially curious as whether the people on the left on the committee thought that was true. And my second question is, I just wondered, this is not in the report, but I wondered, is there any analog at all with public sector unions? Did the committee and the panel think at all about ways that there could be a less adversarial, mutually beneficial reforms to the public sector or union law? Especially, I'm thinking about reforming K through 12 education.
Yeah. Bill, do you want to speak to that? I don't want to speak for the left in the group.
Well, neither do I. But I'll speak for myself. Okay. I saw the Works Council's proposal not as an alternative necessarily to organized labor in the traditional form where it exists, but as you know, it exists almost nowhere in the private sector anymore. Right? The percentage of the private sector that enjoys any sort of collective organization is now down in the single digits. So I personally was willing to go along with this, not as a replacement for something more adversarial, but as, on the principle that something is better than nothing. I'm also guided by the fact that in some other countries, works councils have turned out to be a reasonably effective way, at least of providing a forum for the exchange of voice and views among pieces of the overall process of production that frequently don't talk to each other, where there's a hierarchical relationship and orders come down and maybe there's a complaint box somewhere, but it's not clear whether the complaints go up, and if so, whether they're ever taken seriously. So I have come to believe in arenas for organized dialogue as an improvement on strict hierarchical relationships. So that was my thinking, and it is not. And if one of the consequences is a softening of adversarial relations in those respects in which those relations are not producing very good outcomes, which is frequently the case, okay, but sometimes opposed interests need to go at one another, hammer and tongs, in order for both sides to realize that the other side has a red line that shouldn't be crossed. I'm nattering on, but that's my first response.
Just as a factual matter, I mean, in terms of time spent disputing it, it was very low on the scale. I mean, there were some issues that we came back to over and over, and people quit over, and we never could we wrestled and wrestled and wrestled. It was not one. It was pretty much one where it was proposed, and people said fine. So I'm not saying that everybody loved it or why, but
but I do think that the question is right, that there was an attractiveness to it, is it offered a less adversarial way in which issues could be discussed and worked in a way that might benefit to workers. That definitely was attractive to it. So from my standpoint, when you read about things on this issue, that publications that come more from the left, there's this bemoaning of the loss of the labor union power in the private sector, and then the call for it is let's bring it back as it was. And I always found that kind of impractical and sort of, that's not going to happen. And here was something that offered an opportunity to try something a little different that has worked somewhere else that might accrue to the benefit of workers without promising something that wouldn't happen.
Yeah,
and then just on the public sector thing, I think that's a good idea, but we didn't think of that.
Yeah, a lot of things we didn't think of. But you're reading it as a benefit for the employers. We, I think, almost universally, including on the right, saw it as a benefit for the workers, a chance to have a voice.
Yeah, I will. One other thought, this time from the left, and
I brought out the inner left.
Right, and that is, we are continuing to dine off labor law legislation that was crafted 3/4 of a century ago. I think it needs to be rethought fundamentally. I am, for the reasons previously stated, to the extent that the relationship between labor and management, labor and capital, what have you, is adversarial, at the very least, they are butting horns over the distribution of the surplus produced by the cooperative process of production. And if it is the case, as I believe, that the bargaining power of one side has been radically diminished vis-a-vis the bargaining power of the other, I think that implicates the entire framework of law and regulation within which these relative weights are being established, and I think that needs to be rethought from the ground up. I don't know how to start doing that, but I genuinely believe that.
Okay, we're going to take maybe one more right there in the middle, and then this has been a great discussion. Everybody feeling good up here? Okay, good.
Dan Burns, Catholic University of America. I'm just wondering, it seems the wage supplement idea that a lot of you like seems, and this came up earlier, pretty clearly a major second best to actually having a job that pays you. If we're talking about dignity, to know that you're having a job that pays you half as much as you'd like and the other half is coming from the government, it doesn't come close as far as giving you a source of dignity goes. So I assume it's a second best because the alternative is impossible. Like Bill said, that these better jobs aren't coming back. And I was just hoping you could all say something about why. What is the impossible thing that would have to happen in order for whether public policy can produce it or what would it have to produce it? A hurricane would have to produce it. I have no idea. But what is the impossible thing that would have to happen in order for us to just have more good, reasonably paying working class jobs?
So I want to put a footnote to your assumption before other people answer that. None of us know what the future of work is going to bring, right? But what I see already out there to some degree is obviously routinized jobs, routine jobs are disappearing, but that means that highly skilled jobs are growing. It's a smaller number of highly skilled jobs. But, in the Ford factory, those were not particularly skilled jobs. Advanced manufacturing today, again, those are pretty skilled jobs, and that's a good thing. And so the idea that it is all going to be about subsidies and support and that sort of thing, I think there's a need for something of that, but I think we don't know. And I think that's why I think skills are so important. And I think that we are going to see a very different kind of economy, and skills are going to make a big difference. And there are going to be some good-paying jobs that aren't just lawyers and surgeons. And now Bill can say something different.
Ben, you wanted to comment on that? Or
Sure. I mean,
Bill?
so my take is that look, and I'm not going to say this as eloquently as Bill just said, but there's no way you're going to help this group without stronger labor laws. I just don't see this group ever really progressing without some of the basic protections that were intended for them decades ago. Things like the overtime rule, I don't really get why. I mean, I get why it's controversial, but I mean, come on, we're talking about indexing a threshold to inflation, which has been, it gets real cuts every year, every time we don't boost it. And what you see is you have like 4 million workers. This is what people don't get about DOL and the overtime rule, which happened a few years ago. People at DOL were sitting there, and they're seeing these rampant abuses. People like assistant managers at gas stations who are working 80-hour weeks at minimum wage jobs and not qualifying for overtime because they were classified as assistant managers. This is ridiculous. And this happens in different ways, but it's rampant. Wage theft, being subject to mandatory arbitration, being sued by your employer because you work for a dog food company and you want to go to another one, but you happen to sign non-compete that you didn't understand. And so, I think that skills are really important, but this group will never move forward without getting some basic protection in labor law or getting some bargaining position that unions used to provide. Secondly, can I say really quickly on a wage subsidy? That we did do a wage subsidy. The government, and the Bush administration, the Obama administration, we tried it in 2008. We did it in 2009 through the Making Work Pay tax credit. We had a 2-year, 2 percentage point cut in the payroll tax. If you really want to give workers a tax cut, just give them a tax cut. Just cut the payroll tax. It is the most direct way you can raise after-tax wages, but we do everything through the income tax code or the corporate tax code, which leaves out this group entirely.
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Thank you,
Well,
Ben.
first of all, just to endorse and broaden Ben's last point, by the standards of the rest of the Democratic West, we have a very narrowly based tax code. There are entire sources of revenue that we simply ignore. And that's why so much pressure is focused on the income tax and why it becomes so difficult to achieve publicly important results through a tax code that just isn't broad enough to deal with the underlying problems of the society. But I'm going to give a somewhat different answer to your question, which I think is a very good one. Our set point for good jobs and benefits, and this is a sort of a standard story, was established in an era in which the U.S. economy bestrode the world like a colossus. We enjoyed a surplus as the result of the extraordinarily dominant position that we achieved after World War II, largely because every other economy in the world had been knocked down. We were the only ones standing up. We were half of the world's economy. We're less than a quarter now. But let me be specific. Why are there almost no textile jobs left in South Carolina? Why are there almost no small furniture manufacturers left in North Carolina? Why are there almost no shoe manufacturers left in Maine? Why are there no steel plants left in Pittsburgh? I could go on and on and on, but in each case, producers in other countries at a lower stage of what used to be called economic development when we still believed in progress, in each case, the combination of lower cost producers plus a trade environment that allowed those lower cost producers to globalize their product has produced a decimation of long established mass production industries in the United States. Those mass production industries and the surplus that they enjoyed in the decades after World War II, that's gone. And I cannot think of any way of restoring textile jobs in South Carolina or small furniture jobs in North Carolina or shoe producers in Maine or mass steel production as opposed to Nucor in Pittsburgh. I can't think of any way of doing that without taking the Trump policy and putting it on steroids. Erecting walls, not mainly to people, but to the free flow of goods from the rest of the world. I don't believe that anyone would benefit in the long run from that, including the people who are the subject of this report. So I think for that reason, I do not think we can go back. We have to go forward. Right? Forward to what? Well, this report is the first tentative step in crafting an answer to that fundamental question, forward to what? My objection to MAGA is not the idea of greatness, it's to the word again, because it presupposes a possibility of retrograde movement towards the status quo ante, which I do not believe is feasible, whatever the government does.
Got
So my
Final word.
easy three-part answer to your question of how we get these jobs back. We convince all Americans to pay much higher prices for manufactured goods that are made in the United States. Pay men enough to raise a family on one income. But then if you do that, you also have to send women back to the home. So if we do those three simple things, we could have this great situation that we had in the 1950s and 60s.
Okay, with that, we're going to finish. Thank you all very much. Thank our panel. It was a great day.
Oh, yeah, thank you. That's a great lesson.
Good job. I hope you're happy.
Yeah, you too.